Hi everyone, I'm Carissa. Today I wanted to show you how I like to pick up stitches from my knitting in order to work in a different direction. And today we're going to look at a garter stitch swatch, picking up stitches from the side edge of a garter stitch swatch, a garter stitch swatch where I have slipped the edge stitch. We're also going to look at a stockinette stitch swatch, just normal stockinette stitch, as well as a stockinette stitch where I have slipped the edge stitch. And we are also going to look at picking up stitches from the bind off and the cast on edge as well. The first swatch we're going to look at is just a basic garter stitch swatch where I have knitted every stitch of every row. And that gives me these little bumps along the edge of the fabric. One bump for every 2 rows of garter stitch, or 1 bump for every ridge on my garter stitch fabric. Now, garter stitch, your gauge of course will vary depending on your weight of your yarn and your size of your needles, but roughly as a general rule, you're going to have about twice as many rows per inch in garter stitch as you do stitches. So in my little swatch, for example, I have about 4 stitches per inch, and I have 4 garter ridges, which equals 8 rows per inch. So I have twice as many rows as I do stitches per inch. That actually works out really well because whenever I want to pick up stitches and work in the opposite direction, I'm just going to pick up 1 stitch for each of these bumps, which is every 2 rows of garter stitch. So 1 stitch for every 2 rows means that when I build up more garter stitch fabric on the side going this direction, it's going to work out nicely so that it lays flat, it doesn't ruffle, and it doesn't scrunch in or anything like that. So now let me grab my needle here. And something else I want to point out is that a lot of patterns will refer to picking up stitches or picking up and knitting stitches. So typically when you pick up stitches, all you're doing is picking up those loops and putting them on your needle. That is picking up stitches. What we're going to do today is pick up and knit, which actually involves your working yarn as well. I'm going to use a different color just for demonstration purposes so you can really see what I'm doing. So for each of these bumps, you saw what I just did was to pick up each of these bumps on the edge of the garter stitch. You can pick up, if you look really closely, each ridge has a front loop and a back loop. It does not matter which one you pick up as long as you are consistent. So I'm going to poke right into that first bump. I'm going to poke my needle in there from front to back, and I'm just going to take my working yarn here and loop it over and pull that through my fabric. So picking up stitches is just picking up the loop with my needle. Pick up and knit means to actually draw through a loop of your working yarn. So I've picked up and knitted 1 stitch here. Now I'm going to pick up and knit in the next loop. So I'm going to insert my needle from front to back through that next bump. And I'm going to separate my tail here. Wrap my yarn just as if I'm knitting just like normal, and pull that through the fabric, through that little hole, and there's my second stitch. Pick up and knit 2 stitches. And now my third bump, so I'm going to go into that bump right there from front to back, wrap my yarn, pull it through, and there's stitch number 3. And I'm going to show you a different method. If you find it difficult to poke your needle through that loop, you can use the other knitting needle to pick up the stitch from left to right onto your left needle, and then insert your right needle just as if you're knitting, wrap the yarn and pull it through, and then you can drop that stitch that you picked up off the left hand needle. So I've achieved the same thing in a different way. So again, I'm going to use my left needle to go into that next bump from left to right, and then I'm going to use my right needle to simply knit that bump off the left needle. There we go. And I've got one more bump here. I'm going to pick that up with my left needle, and I'm going to knit it with my right needle. Pull that through off the left needle. Now I have picked up 6 stitches, picked up and knitted 6 stitches along the side of my garter stitch swatch. Now I'm going to go ahead and knit another row or 2 so that I can show you a little bit better what that looks like. So I'm just going to continue knitting. And it doesn't matter whether you knit continental style like I'm doing now, or English style with the yarn in your right hand. Does not make a difference. Simply knitting. Oops. There we go. So I've knitted 2 rows. So you can see my garter stitches starting to form in the opposite direction from my original garter stitch swatch. And if we look at the wrong side of the fabric, this is what that looks like. When I've picked up stitches, you get that sort of dotted line that looks like purl bumps when you change colors. So this is the wrong side of our fabric. So that is how I would pick up stitches along the edge of a garter stitch swatch, just a normal garter stitch swatch. The next swatch we're going to look at is also a garter stitch swatch, but here I have slipped the last stitch of each row to give me this nice slipped stitch edge, which looks like a column of V's going up the edge of my fabric. It's still garter stitch, but that last stitch getting slipped gives me this nice smooth, non-bumpy slip stitch edge on my garter stitch fabric. Because that last stitch is slipped at the end of every row, so when I'm coming this direction, I'm knitting this direction, I slip that stitch, but then when I turn back around, that becomes the first stitch of the next row, so it gets knitted, and I work back across this row and I slip this last stitch here. So those slip stitch edges, they only get worked once for every 2 rows of garter stitch. So each of these V's along the edge of the fabric actually represents 2 rows. Just like the bumps along our garter stitch swatch that we looked at the first time, each V here is 2 rows. So we still want to pick up 1 stitch for every 2 rows in garter stitch, so we're going to pick up 1 stitch in each of these V's. So I'm going to take my needle, and I'm going to look at that first V there, a little hard to see. I'm going to go under both legs of that V from front to back. I've gone under both legs with my right hand needle from front to back. And I'm going to take my working yarn and drape that over my needle. Hold tension on that and pull it through the fabric. And now I have picked up and knitted 1 stitch. There's my next V just below that. So I'm going to insert my right hand needle under both legs of that V. Take my working yarn not the tail. And wrap that and pull it through. And now I've picked up and knitted a second stitch. So again, there's my third V. So I'm going to go under both legs of that V from front to back. Wrap my yarn, pull it through, and there's my third stitch. And just like before, we can use our left-hand needle. If you have trouble picking up those stitches with the right-hand needle, you can, okay, there's my next V. So I can use my left-hand needle and go under both legs of that V, and then use my right-hand needle to knit that as if it were just a normal stitch. So again, I'm still going to go under both legs of that V that's on the left-hand needle and knit, and then slip it off the left-hand needle, and there's stitch number 4. And then there's my next V on the edge, so under both legs of that V with my left-hand needle, and use my right-hand needle to knit both legs of that V off the left-hand needle. And I have one more V at the bottom of my selvage edge here. So pick those up with my left-hand needle, insert my right-hand needle, and knit both of those legs together. So now I've picked up 6 stitches along the edge of my garter stitch swatch with the slipped stitch edge. Again, I'm going to work a couple rows here so that we can get a better idea of what that looks like. So just going to knit a row here, turn my work, knit another row, okay, so I've worked 2 additional rows after I picked up and knitted stitches. So if I look at the wrong side of my fabric here, I can still see those V's that I picked up. When I picked up stitches on my first normal garter stitch swatch with the bumps, it gave me that dotted line of purl bumps, it looked like. But here with the slip stitch edge, I can still see those V's on the back side of the fabric, and it looks sort of like a sewn seam. So there is picking up and knitting stitches on a garter stitch swatch with a slipped stitch edge. Now we're going to look at picking up and knitting stitches from a stockinette stitch swatch. And this is just standard stockinette stitch where I have knitted every stitch on my right side rows and purled every stitch on my wrong side rows. So there's not a slip stitch edge, this is just standard stockinette stitch. And the edge of the fabric here, you get those V's like we did with the slip stitch edge, but they're not always nice and neat. You'll usually have a looser, taller, longer V followed by a shorter, tighter V. Loose V, tight V, long V, short V. But every stitch here was worked, none of them were slipped. So each of these V's represents one row. Now, unlike garter stitch, where I said we had roughly twice as many rows per inch as we do stitches per inch, unlike that, with stockinette stitch, you'll typically have approximately 2 stitches for every 3 rows. So let's look at my gauge here. I've got about 4 stitches per inch, and let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 rows per inch. So 4 stitches and 6 rows in every inch. That's 2 stitches for every 3 rows. So when we go to pick up stitches along the edge here, if we want our fabric that we build off in this direction to lay flat, not ruffle, not pull in, then we need to account for that gauge difference between rows and stitches. So rather than picking up 1 stitch for every 2 rows like we did in garter stitch, with stockinette, with this gauge in particular, we're going to pick up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. And each of these V's represents 1 row. So we're going to pick up 2 of these and skip the 3rd. Pick up 2 and skip the 3rd. So that way we are picking up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. With stockinette stitch, we want to, instead of looking at both legs of that V like we did with the slip stitch edge, we actually want to sort of spread out our fabric and look at those horizontal strands between the last stitch and the second to last stitch. And that is actually where we're going to poke our needle in. So here's my first V up top, is this little tight V at the top. But instead of going under both legs of that, I'm just going to go straight down into the hole between that V and the second to last stitch on that same row. So I'm going to poke down straight through that hole into the back of my fabric. I'm going to wrap my yarn around my needle and pull that stitch through to the front. And I've picked up and knitted 1 stitch. And now I'm going to look below that. So there's that horizontal strand between the last stitch and the second to last stitch. Below that is the next hole that I'm going to poke into. So I'm going to poke my right needle through that hole from front to back. I'm going to wrap my yarn around and pull that through. And there's my second stitch picked up. And again, there's my horizontal bar between the last and second to last stitch. So I'm going to go on the other side of that horizontal bar. There's my next hole that I want to poke my needle into and pick up a stitch. There we go. And again, you can use the other needle if you like. So there's this right here is the horizontal bar between the last and the second to last stitch. So I picked up from this hole. Now I'm going to go into this hole right here. So I'm going to go through the fabric from front to back with my left hand needle, and then I'm going to use my right hand needle to go into that same hole and knit. And then I can remove my left hand needle. Same thing here. There's my horizontal bar. So I want to go into the hole below that with my left hand needle. And then I can insert my right hand needle as well and knit. Now what I've been showing you here was picking up from every stitch, every row rather, along the edge. And like I said, because of our stockinette stitch gauge, we only really want to pick up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. So, pull my needle out, and we're going to start over, but instead of going into every single hole, I'm going to go into 1, 2, skip 3. 1, 2, skip 3. So I'm going to go into the first hole there, drape my yarn over and pull that through. Then I'll go into the second hole, so there's that horizontal bar. So I'm going to go on the other side of that into the next hole. Wrap my yarn and pull through. So I've picked up 2 stitches. I'm going to skip the 3rd row, the 3rd hole. So I'm going to skip that one and go to this one next, the 4th one. Wrap, oops, and pick up a stitch. There we go. And then I'm going to go into the 5th hole, the next one down. So now I've picked up 2 more. I'm going to skip the third again and go into the next one after that. So I'm going to skip this one and go into that one instead. And wrap and pull through and go into the next hole there below my horizontal bar, that hole right there, wrap and pull through, and then I'm going to skip the third hole, which is right there. I'm not going to pick up a stitch there, and that's my last hole, so I'm done. So I've picked up 6 stitches, but I skipped. You can see there's a little bit of gap between the first 2 and the second 2 and the third 2. There's a little bit of gap where I skipped a stitch, or skipped a row rather, whenever I was picking up and knitting stitches. Now I'm going to work a couple rows of stockinette stitch so we can really get a good idea of what that looks like. So I'm on the wrong side. I'm just going to purl here. And again, it does not matter if you work continental style with the yarn in your left hand or English style with the yarn in your right hand. Just making stockinette stitch so you work however you are accustomed. So I'm going to knit this right side row. And now that I have a couple rows of stockinette stitch, if I lay my work down, you can see that that is laying nice and flat. It's not ruffling, it's not pulling in on the fabric. My gauge matches nicely. And if I flip it over and we look at the back, you sort of get that same effect that we did with the selvage stitch or the slip stitch edge on our garter stitch fabric. You get those V's, but they're not the nice clean V's. They're the long V, short V, long V, short V, long V, short V. But it still looks sort of like a seamed edge. And there we go. That is stockinette stitch with no slip stitch edge. Our fourth swatch is stockinette stitch again, but this time I have slipped the last stitch of each row so that I end up with those nice clean V's along the edge like I did with my second garter stitch swatch. And again, each V represents 2 rows because each of these end stitches only gets worked every other row. But since I'm working stockinette stitch and not garter stitch, I want to pick up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. And that ratio may vary. Check your pattern and see what it recommends. But in general, for stockinette stitch, 2 stitches for every 3 rows is a good rule. So we still want to not look at the V's on the edge, but the horizontal bars between the last stitch and the second to last stitch. So I'm going to use my needle here and sort of poke through here, and you can see between this V and this V there are actually 2 horizontal bars there. When you work a slip stitch edge, it sort of squishes together the horizontal bars on every other row, so you end up with this big hole where your slip stitch is. It's really easy to see, and then you're going to have a little hole following it where your 2 horizontal bars are really close together, and you kind of got to use your needle to work those apart to be able to poke your needle through. So when we pick up stitches, we're going to work that first hole is one of those little tight ones. So we've got this big hole here, but above that there is a little hole with 2 horizontal bars very close together. So I'm going to use my needle and just poke through between those 2 horizontal bars. Drape my yarn over and pull that through. And now I've picked up 1 stitch in that little hole. Now I'm going to pick up a stitch in that big obvious hole. So poke through there and knot my tail, working yarn, wrap, and pull up a stitch. And there's 2 stitches picked up. And then after the big hole that I just picked up through, I've got another 2 horizontal bars that are really close together. So I would go in between those, kind of work them apart, and stick my needle in between there. But again, this is stockinette stitch. I want to pick up 2 and then skip the 3rd. So I'm going to skip that little hole and I'm going to go into the next big hole. All right, big obvious hole, really easy to pick up. Wrap and pull through. Then I want to go into the very next hole, which is one of those little ones where the 2 horizontal bars are squished together. So I'm going to use my needle to poke through in between those 2 horizontal bars, wrap and pull through. So now I've picked up 2 more. I want to skip the 3rd again. So I'm going to skip that big obvious hole and I'm going to go into the little hole after that between those 2 horizontal bars. And again, if you need to use your other needle, that is perfectly fine. So I picked up 2 in a row, so I'm skipping this big hole here, and I'm going to go into the little hole between those 2 horizontal bars. So I'm going to go right in there in between them. And then I'll use my right hand needle into the same little hole, wrap and knit. And then I can remove my left needle. And then I want to go into the very next hole, which is a big obvious hole here under that horizontal bar. So I'm going to go into that hole with my left needle, into the same hole with my right needle, and wrap and knit and remove my left needle. And there we go. I have picked up 2 stitches for every 3 rows in my stockinette stitch swatch here. I'm going to work a couple rows so that we can see how that goes. So on the wrong side, I'm going to purl. And on the right side, I'm going to knit. And now that I have a couple rows, if I lay my work flat, you can see that that's not ruffling or puckering. The gauge matches nicely. And on the backhand side, we have those nice clean V's of our selvage stitch that kind of looks like a sewn seam. And there we go. So that is picking up stitches on a stockinette stitch swatch with a slip stitch edge. Lastly, I wanted to show you how to pick up stitches from the cast on and the bind off edges as well. This is a little bit easier because you don't have to worry about 2 stitches for 3 rows or 1 stitch for 2 rows or anything like that, because you're going to be picking up stitches and working in the same direction as your original swatch. It's a 1-for-1 ratio. Pick up 1 stitch for every stitch. So if we let's look at our bind off edge first, and I just used a traditional bind off method on this swatch. Your edge might look a little bit different depending on the type of bind off you use. But you can see those nice clean V's. And again, we're just going to pick up 1 stitch for every stitch that we bound off. And I'm just going to start a little in from the edge here just to make it quick. So there's 1 V. I'm going to go under both legs of that V. Drape my yarn over, pull a stitch through, and then I'll go under both legs of the next V. Not with the tail, wrap my yarn, pull that through, and under both legs of the next V, wrap, and pull through. And again, you can use your left hand needle if it helps. So I'll go under both legs of the next V, and then use my right hand needle to knit those as if it were a normal stitch. A little bit tight with the bind off. And then left needle into both legs of the next V and knit that using my right needle. One more, there's my next V. Left needle from front to back under both legs, and right needle knits it. There we go. So now I've picked up, I didn't pick up all the way from edge to edge, but I picked up 6 stitches in the center here, and I picked them up from 6 stitches of my original swatch. Now let's look at the cast on edge. Again, so I'm going to flip my swatch over here. Again, your cast on edge may look a little bit different depending on what cast on method you used. I used a long tail method here. So I've kind of got those V's as well, but it's not quite the same. So what I'm going to do here is actually look at the columns of stitches below, and I'm going to insert my needle into the uppermost V that I can see here. So right in there, just stab that all the way through from front to back. So again, here's my column of V's that I'm looking at, and the uppermost V before the cast on edge. I'm gonna just poke my needle through, drape my yarn over, and pull a stitch through. And then I'll go to the next column of V's and poke into that very top stitch. Wrap my yarn, pull through, and into the next one. There's my column of V's. I'm going to poke into that top stitch, wrap my yarn, and pull it through. And you can use your left needle if it helps. So there's the stitch that I just picked up. So the next column of V's is here. I'm going to put my left needle into that top stitch right there. Oops. And I'm going to use my right needle to knit through that same hole. And again, so here's the next column, and there's that top stitch right there. I poke into that and knit it. And let's do one more. So here's my next column of stitches, and I'm going to find the top V right there before the cast on edge. Poke my left needle through that and use my right needle to knit it. And there we have 6 stitches picked up and knitted from our cast on edge, and that is 6 stitches picked up from 6 stitches. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So you don't have to worry about gauge or anything like that. And there you have it. Picking up and knitting stitches from garter stitch and stockinette, both from the side, the cast on, and the bind off. I hope this helps you in your knitting adventures.